Hi, I'm Armand Diaz here to talk about Venus retrograde. Now, you know about Mercury retrograde. Everybody knows about Mercury retrograde. And you know about Mars retrograde. If you've been watching the videos, you do anyway. You can just scroll down on the video page and get to Mars retrograde if you need it. But nothing quite captures the imagination like Venus retrograde. After all, Venus is the goddess of love, the goddess of beauty, the planet that rules our relationships. And so when Venus goes retrograde, we expect something will happen, or perhaps we expect that nothing will happen. And that's the big question. What is Venus retrograde all about? It's about many, many things, and we're going to talk about them today. In her Taurian mood, because Venus rules Taurus, or is associated with the sign of Taurus, Venus is very much about pleasure, about the senses. And in her Libran mode, Venus is associated with beauty and relationship and values. Really, values are kind of both a Taurian and Libran thing. The point is that Venus is very much the planet of aesthetics, the planet of the softer, more let's say, finer aspects of life. Mars may be the sexual drive, but Venus is relationship. Mercury may be commerce, but Venus says, well, what do we really value? And so Venus is a planet that has a very sort of finer sensibility about things. And when Venus goes retrograde, we reconsider what we value. Now, I always give you the book. The book on Venus retrograde is that it's a bad time to begin relationships. It's a bad time to begin artistic endeavors. It's a bad time to do a lot of stuff. Now, the truth of the matter is, energy may be lacking for these things. If you start a new relationship, it may not be the best time, but it's not because we're somehow fated to have a bad time during Venus retrograde. Rather, it's a time when we go inwards and consult our values and say, well, what is it I really want in relationship? What is it I really want to do creatively? It's not so much that we're prevented from going forward, so much as we're drawn inwards to consider what it is we really do want to do. As with any retrograde, we tend to get excited about the things that Venus rules. So, for example, when Mercury goes retrograde, we often want to buy software. We often think we found a really good book that we have to buy and read. When Venus is retrograde, we very frequently want relationship. We very frequently want to do something artistic. We very frequently want to find out the value of something. We want to have our house assessed. We want to have that. It's not a great time to go on Antiques Roadshow if you get my drift. Now, while I wouldn't necessarily go about launching a major project on purpose when Venus is retrograde, I kind of feel that if you're sort of drawn to a relationship, if you're sort of drawn to some sort of creative endeavor, it's not a bad time to go ahead with it. There might be setbacks. Things may not work out exactly as planned, but it doesn't mean that you can't have a valuable experience from it. In fact, it's not only romantic relationships, but partnerships of all kinds. And if you look at, say, for example, company merges that happen when Venus is retrograde, they very frequently don't go all that well. Of course, the book on Venus retrograde would say that it's a poor time to get married, but that's also kind of a question. It is something that is maybe a little bit challenging, but I think it also does bring the values inwards. And, you know, I don't know if it's a great time to, let's say, for example, spontaneously decide to elope, but if you planned your wedding for Venus retrograde, you'll be fine. Probably. Now, there's that question about old lovers coming back. Do old lovers come back when Venus is retrograde? Well, maybe it's a little bit more likely when Venus is retrograde than at other times, or, maybe it's just that we perceive it more. It's not a strategy for Venus retrograde, though. Don't say to yourself, well, Venus is retrograde, I'll give so-and-so a call because that's what I'm supposed to do. If somebody comes back into your life when Venus is retrograde, it probably is not to rekindle things and get things started, or to the extent that it is, it's often a sort of finishing up of business. We had a relationship, we broke off, and now we get back together again and sort of reconsider things. We finish up the work that needs to be done and then kind of go the separate way. Once in a great while, a very strong relationship will reignite under Venus retrograde, but most of the time it has that kind of finishing up business thing. As a matter of fact, most of the time it has the kind of just saying hi type of feeling to it. There's not any real romantic thing at all. It's just, you run into somebody in the food store and say hi. Now, there's a deeper side to Venus retrograde. I mean, on one hand, it's, old relationships and so on. But on the other hand, we can see that Venus retrograde has been associated with a real purging and perdition. Venus is the finer things in life, the things that we really like, the things that we really value. And when Venus is retrograde, there was historically a backing away from those things, a going inward, and a kind of collective or individual guilt, it seems, for those things. We have to reflect that the flood was 40 days long. And we can look at the Muslim month of Ramadan and see that that's 40 days long, as is the Christian Lenten season, 40 days long. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert before really beginning his ministry. And by what we call solar progression, we can see that the 40 years of the Jews wandering in the desert is another manifestation of this 40 days. So it was apparently pretty serious doings. I know that those 40-day periods are associated with specific times, but I think that was kind of nailing the Venus retrograde to a specific time. But that 40 days really suggests Venus retrograde, because Venus does retrograde for that amount of time. I don't think we need to take things quite so seriously, but maybe it is a good time for us to kind of back away from things and at least be very mindful of what we do for pleasure, what it is we do that we value, and sort of avoid that kind of automatic pilot thing. You probably go to a restaurant that you've been looking forward to, and about halfway, three-quarters, maybe right when you have 2 bites left of the food, you say, I should have really tasted this. A lot of times we look forward to doing things and we just sort of do them in a sort of compulsive way. One thing about, let's say, giving something up for Lent or refraining from eating during the day or something like that is it makes you aware of it. It makes you aware that you value it. It makes you aware that you have pleasure from it, and it really focuses you on it. And something like that is not a bad idea. I wouldn't give up all pleasure. Just don't have that personality. But it might be a good idea to find something that you can either give up for 40 days or at least back away from, or at least those things that you are engaged in, you pay a little bit more attention to them. It could be a really great time to really, I wouldn't say it's a great time to really indulge. It might be. It might be a fun time to really indulge and just see what happens. But it might be a good time to just sort of play with those things that give you pleasure and see what happens if you stop for just a minute. What happens if you hesitate for just a little while? Anyway, the worst comes to the worst. Venus retrograde lasts 40 days, and then you can go back to, automatic pilot with the pleasures. And that's okay.